The Vanishing Act. Off the coast of Florida, 1968. The summer of 1968 was a pressure cooker, the Cold War. A silent, deadly chess match played beneath the waves. Every Soviet submarine that left port was a pawn in this high-stakes game, and their objective was always the same: penetrate the enemy's sanctuary, observe, and remain unseen. The target of this particular mission was unprecedentedly bold. Submarine K-315, a diesel-electric hunter of the Northern Fleet, was not ordered into the familiar, murky waters of the Barents Sea. Instead, she was tasked with a deep penetration mission to approach the eastern U.S. coastline, specifically the waters near Florida, where American naval power and strategic assets were concentrated. The objective, codenamed Red Shadow, was simple but nearly impossible: test the limits of Western anti-submarine defenses and gather acoustic intelligence on the United States' newest ballistic missile programs. Aboard were 82 men, led by Captain Anatoly Vasilev, a submariner whose reputation for daring and precision was legendary within the Soviet Navy. For his crew, this was the mission of a lifetime, a moment of immense, dangerous prestige. For days, the K-315 moved like a ghost, relying on the deep, cold currents of the Atlantic to mask her diesel engines. She successfully skirted NATO patrol zones, a miracle of Soviet naval navigation and stealth. By the beginning of July, K-315 was positioned within striking distance of the American coast. The crew was tense but exhilarated. They had done the impossible. They had reached the heart of the enemy's operational zone. Captain Vasilev, a man rarely prone to outward emotion, radioed Moscow. His report was cryptic, using approved code phrases that suggested success and an imminent shift to the observation phase. But the night of July 5th brought a shift in the acoustic pattern. Petty Officer Dmitry Volkov, manning the sonar station, reported a sudden flurry of activity. Distant, high-frequency pings that suggested the Americans were on alert, perhaps reacting to an unrelated target. Or worse, they had finally detected the K-315. Vasilev ordered the sub deeper, forcing her to the absolute edge of her crush depth. At 02:15 Moscow time, the K-315 sent her final transmission. It was a fragment, a hurried burst of coded data indicating they were experiencing unexpected acoustic pressure, followed by a scrambled voice report from the captain himself. The transmission ended abruptly, truncated mid-word by a sudden, catastrophic silence. The last chilling word that crackled through the secure channels back to Moscow's main naval staff was a single, terrifying confirmation: observing, then nothing. The K-315 had vanished. In the ensuing moments, the invisible thread connecting the submarine to the motherland snapped completely. Soviet naval intelligence spent the next few hours desperately trying to re-establish contact, sending blind bursts of radio signals, but the vastness of the Atlantic swallowed every wave. The silence was not limited to the Soviet side. Miles above the surface, an American SIGINT satellite, part of a top-secret reconnaissance program, detected a brief, sharp splash in the exact quadrant where the Soviet submarine was suspected to be operating. It was a hydrophone spike that suggested something large, and metal had encountered a sudden, violent change in pressure. Then came the complete silence. The anomaly was instantly flagged and routed to the highest levels of the Pentagon. Moscow was forced to accept the unthinkable. An elite submarine, carrying a critical mission, and 82 experienced men, had been lost, not in the comfortable territory of the Arctic, but right under the nose of the American military machine. The USSR launched a massive search, but it was an exercise in futility, a shadow dance in enemy waters they could not openly acknowledge. Surface ships and aircraft were discreetly diverted, focusing on a non-existent naval exercise far from the true site of the tragedy. Nothing was ever found. For weeks, Soviet trawlers and research vessels secretly dragged the seabed. Acoustic buoys were deployed, and Soviet intelligence desperately monitored U.S. naval traffic for any clues. The Americans, for their part, maintained absolute radio silence on the matter. They knew something was lost off their coast, but whether it was an accident, a sinking, or a sophisticated decoy, they couldn't confirm. By late August, the Kremlin had made its decision. The submarine K-315 was declared lost. The men of her crew, including Captain Anatoly Vasilev, were presumed dead. Their names were quietly placed on a restricted list, their families given meager official letters citing only loss at sea during the performance of duty. No details, no grave, no monument. The Soviet Union had simply absorbed the loss, burying the truth of the incident beneath layers of Cold War secrecy and bureaucratic indifference. But the mystery was too great to be buried completely. The K-315 had disappeared without a trace, without debris, without an oil slick. She had not only gone silent, but she had erased her presence from the ocean floor itself, leaving behind a technological and geopolitical puzzle. 2.5 decades would pass, a generation would grow up, and the mighty Soviet Union itself would fall. The files on the K-315 would gather dust in a top-secret military vault in Moscow, a morbid footnote in naval history. Yet, as the world of 1968 gave way to the world of the 1990s, the ocean was preparing to speak. The silence was about to be broken. 25 years later, a strange signal was received, and everything changed. The disappearance of K-315 created an immediate, desperate, and utterly secret crisis within the Soviet Navy. They had lost a vessel packed with advanced reconnaissance equipment and 82 highly trained sailors in the most hostile waters imaginable. The loss of life was secondary to the geopolitical catastrophe. If the Americans knew a Soviet boat had sunk off their coast, it would be an enormous propaganda coup and a humiliating failure for Moscow. Admiral Sergei Gromov, the stern-faced commander of the Northern Fleet, ordered the most comprehensive search operation the Soviet Navy could mount without formally declaring a rescue mission. The cover story was a sudden, massive surge in oceanographic research in the mid-Atlantic. Civilian trawlers and hydrographic vessels, equipped with specialized deep-sea sensors, were rushed to the supposed area of the sub's last transmission. The orders given to Captain Grigory Antonov, commander of the research vessel Lomonosov, were simple. Find debris, find an oil slick, find anything that could confirm the sub's location, and report immediately via secure channel. Antonov's crew worked relentlessly, dragging acoustic arrays across thousands of square miles of the vast, unforgiving ocean. But the ocean offered only silence. The total absence of any physical evidence was the first true anomaly. When a submarine is lost at depth, especially a diesel-electric model like the K-315, the deep-sea pressure typically causes a catastrophic hull implosion. This event is violent, resulting in debris scattered across the seabed and, crucially, a massive, highly specific acoustic signature known as a crushed depth signal. Furthermore, ruptured fuel tanks and lubrication systems inevitably create a visible oil slick on the surface, sometimes spanning miles. In the waters off the U.S. coast, there was none of it. Not a single piece of painted metal, not a drop of diesel fuel, not a detectable crush on the acoustic records. For days, the Soviet vessels reported only the monotonous sounds of the deep, the clicking of shrimp, the roar of passing storms, the quiet, distant hum of commercial traffic. Nothing was ever found. In the Kremlin, the quiet despair turned into suspicion. Without wreckage, several terrifying possibilities emerged in the closed-door meetings. Massive internal failure, an instantaneous, total internal explosion, perhaps of the battery bank or torpedo stores, that vaporized the vessel before it could implode. Highly unlikely. Capture by the enemy. Could the K-315 have been secretly cornered, disabled, and towed away by a highly advanced U.S. anti-submarine unit? Dramatization, defection. The captain, driven by internal conflict or political belief, could have defected, using the Red Shadow mission as a cover. Each hypothesis was more politically explosive than the last. The KGB, already briefed on the classified mission, took over the full investigation. They began questioning the families and friends of the crew, looking for any sign of disloyalty or pre-mission distress. The consensus quickly became to officially classify the loss as an unspecified technical fault, a diplomatic shield against admitting a failure so close to U.S. shores. The wives and children of the crew were left to grapple with the state's cold, final verdict. Young Ivan Petrov, the boat's radio operator, had promised his mother he'd bring her a small seashell from the southern waters. Instead, she received a terse, typed notice from the Ministry of Defense. There was no funeral, no coffin, no body to mourn over. Only the haunting phrase, "Lost at sea, presumed dead." The tragedy was complete, cemented by the impenetrable silence of the state. Admiral Gromov, facing intense political pressure, finally signed the order to terminate the active search. He knew the truth was likely lying somewhere in the American deep, but he couldn't afford a shooting war just to retrieve a few scraps of metal. The files on K-315 were sealed, stamped, top secret, circumstances unverified. The Phantom submarine became a silent scar on the history of the Soviet Navy. 2.5 decades of silence would follow, but the men of the American intelligence community had their own classified files on the incident. They had seen the seismic spike, noted the sudden radio silence, and now they had observed the secretive, frantic, yet ultimately fruitless Soviet search. They didn't know what happened, but they knew where it happened, and they knew Moscow was desperate. The shadow of K-315 was about to shift its location, from the depths of the Atlantic to the secure war rooms of the Pentagon. The Pentagon's ghost, watching the silence. The sudden, complete disappearance of a large Soviet submarine off the U.S. coast was not a matter of relief for Washington, but of acute strategic anxiety. The Pentagon and the CIA were immediately locked into a terrifying puzzle. American intelligence had been tracking the K-315 for days. Their sophisticated underwater hydrophone arrays, the top-secret SOSUS network, had registered the intrusion. They knew Captain Vasilev was there, and they knew his boat was operating at an incredible, dangerous depth, pushing the limits of Soviet naval engineering. When the final, distorted transmission ended, marked by that brief acoustic spike, analysts at the National Security Agency, NSA, concluded the boat had been violently lost. Yet, like their Soviet counterparts, the U.S. military could not reconcile the loss with the evidence. Commander James O'Connell, a naval intelligence officer assigned to the incident, summarized the central paradox in a classified memo. "We have confirmed the terminus of the Soviet vessel's activity. Its radio silence is absolute, but we lack the corpus delicti. A sub imploding at that depth leaves a signature. We detected a splash, a transient pressure wave, but no subsequent debris field, no long-lasting acoustic decay, and critically, no massive hull crush signature." The Americans understood the implications. Either the K-315 had suffered an unprecedented, instantaneous failure that vaporized the metal and crew, or something far more complex had occurred. The deepest concern, discussed only in guarded rooms at Langley and the Pentagon, was the possibility of a successful, covert Soviet retrieval. Moscow was known for its technical daring. Could they have developed a deep-sea recovery system so effective it removed all trace? U.S. satellites and reconnaissance aircraft were immediately tasked with monitoring the deep Atlantic search zone. They watched the desperate Soviet trawlers, working in shifts, noted the erratic patterns of the research vessels, and confirmed what Moscow had already determined. Nothing was ever found. This reinforced a darker suspicion in the CIA. Perhaps the K-315 wasn't lost at all. What if the sudden silence and the acoustic splash were part of an elaborate Soviet deception plan? The analysis quickly fractured into three primary hypotheses. Total technical catastrophe, the most plausible, if baffling version. The sub's experimental equipment, or a massive battery bank failure, resulted in an explosion that disintegrated the vessel before it reached crush depth. Covert intervention. The K-315 was sunk by an unmarked, deep-diving U.S. or Allied submarine operating in a silent, high-risk intercept. This option, while militarily viable, was politically toxic and vehemently denied by Naval Command. Deliberate staging, the ghost sub. This was the wildest but most unsettling theory. The K-315 was not on a reconnaissance mission, but on a delivery mission, perhaps transporting experimental nuclear components or deep-sea listening devices. And the loss was staged to draw the U.S. focus away from the vessel's actual, hidden mission location in a remote part of the ocean. Admiral Richard Hayes, addressing a closed session of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, ultimately issued a decisive order. "We treat this as a confirmed loss, but the investigation file remains Category 1. Eyes only. The Soviets lost a ghost in our waters. We must ensure that ghost stays buried." The U.S. government, much like the USSR, chose silence. The incident was scrubbed from public-facing logs and relegated to a few locked file drawers under the codename Project Sunken Echo. The true location of the acoustic spike, and the fact that a Soviet sub had penetrated so deeply into the American sphere of influence, was deemed too sensitive for any public disclosure. The fact that the Soviets had failed to find any debris made the lack of wreckage less of an American embarrassment and more of an international anomaly. As the years of the Cold War dragged on, the K-315 faded into the background noise of military history, a line on a casualty list, a file that no one dared open. The official narrative in both nations was simple. The ocean keeps its secrets, but the ocean does not forget. And the secret of the K-315 was not lying at the bottom, waiting to be found. It was waiting for the right moment to return. In a vault in Moscow, the KGB was preparing its own final assessment, one that hinted at a truth even more disturbing than the Pentagon's wildest theories. The Kremlin's cold calculation, sealing the files. The shockwave from the K-315's disappearance resonated deepest not in the stormy Atlantic, but within the silent walls of the KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square. The failure was not merely a loss of a submarine. It was a profound strategic and ideological defeat. How could the most advanced silent hunter in the Soviet fleet vanish without trace directly off the shores of the capitalist enemy? Admiral Gromov's initial report to the Central Committee was met with disbelief. The total lack of wreckage defied every known principle of naval engineering and deep-sea disaster. In the ensuing closed-door meetings, the focus shifted from recovery to damage control and internal security. The KGB took command, viewing the incident less as an accident and more as a possible act of treason or sabotage. A special internal commission was formed, headed by Colonel Viktor Chernov, a man whose loyalty was matched only by his ruthlessness. Chernov's mandate was chillingly clear: disprove the three most politically toxic theories. The first theory, collision with an American submarine, was quickly suppressed. While plausible in the intense game of chicken played beneath the waves, confirming it would mean war, or at least a full-blown international crisis the USSR could not afford over a technical failure. All reports suggesting U.S. involvement were marked disregard and placed in the deepest archive. The second theory, Captain Vasilev's defection, was examined with KGB scrutiny. Vasilev was a dedicated communist, but the possibility that he, or a core group of his officers, had staged the disappearance to hand over the K-315's advanced technology to the West was terrifying. Chernov's agents interviewed dozens of family members and colleagues. They found no evidence of dissent, only stunned grief, but the possibility was never entirely dismissed. The disappearance without debris served as too perfect a cover for an elaborate handover. The third, and most unsettling hypothesis emerged from the very technical analysts tasked with explaining the nothingness. The K-315 was lost during a highly secret, unauthorized experiment on board. Rumors circulated in the deepest circles of the Ministry of Defense about experimental low-frequency jamming systems, or new, plasma-based cloaking technology being tested far from official ranges. The boat had been on a secret mission, Red Shadow, after all. Was the mission itself the cause of her vanishing? If so, the embarrassment of the failure was too great to ever be admitted. Colonel Chernov ultimately delivered his final, carefully crafted verdict: probable catastrophic internal pressure failure resulting from rapid descent and technical error. Cause unverified. This phrase, cause unverified, was the bureaucratic magic needed to seal the truth. It allowed Moscow to maintain the official stance of accidental loss while quietly maintaining the option of defection or sabotage in their secret files. The K-315 was officially listed as a heroic loss, and the files were stamped Soversheno Sekretno, top secret, and placed in a concrete vault in Moscow. But within those folders, Chernov had left a final, unnerving internal note. The object did not sink. It merely ceased to be where it was supposed to be. Until we confirm wreckage, the possibility of a return must be maintained. Years turned into decades. The Cold War intensified, then sputtered, and finally ended. The Soviet Union itself dissolved, and the great strategic chessboard was swept clean. The story of Captain Vasilev and his 82 men became a quiet legend, a ghost story whispered by old sailors. But the ocean still held the secret of that missing acoustic signature. And 25 years after the silence began, the new world of the 1990s was about to receive a signal from the forgotten past. The files, locked away and forgotten in a dusty KGB vault, were about to become relevant again. The change began with a nearly imperceptible tremor in the deep, far from where K-315 was supposed to be resting. The Echo from the Abyss, 1993. The decades that followed the disappearance of K-315 were defined by change. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the furious paranoia of the Cold War gave way to the messy, unstable calm of the 1990s. The once mighty Soviet Navy, now the Russian fleet, was struggling to maintain its aging vessels, let alone worry about ghosts from 1968. Yet, the deep ocean remained timeless. In the summer of 1993, the focus of deep-sea research was far from the political theater of the world. Off the coast of Puerto Rico, nearly 1,000 miles south of the K-315's last confirmed location, a team of oceanographers from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution was conducting acoustic mapping of the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest spots in the Atlantic. Their mission, utilizing a newly developed deep-tow sonar array, was purely scientific. Study the geological stresses of the tectonic plates. For weeks, the sonar sent powerful pulses into the crushing blackness. The recordings were filled with expected echoes: the shape of the seabed, the stratification of sediment, the quiet life of the deep. Then, at 03:45 on a clear Tuesday morning, the instruments registered an anomaly. It wasn't the sharp, violent signature of an implosion or the rhythmic noise of a propeller. It was a faint, nearly harmonic signal, almost too regular to be natural. It was a metallic echo that seemed to emanate not from the trench floor, but from a dense, regular object suspended in the vast column of water. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the lead acoustician, initially dismissed it as interference from their own vessel. But when the deep tow array passed over the same quadrant hours later, the signal returned, louder this time, its distinct signature confirming a massive, man-made metallic hull. It was sitting, or perhaps resting, on a small underwater shelf, at a depth no conventional submarine could possibly survive. The data was complex, filtered through multiple layers of water pressure, but the shape was undeniable. A long, cylindrical hull with a distinct sail. The scientists were mystified. No allied nation had publicly lost a sub in this deep-sea region, and definitely not one large enough to generate this echo. The discovery was immediately flagged to the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI. Within 12 hours, the Woods Hole research vessel was intercepted by a fast-moving, unmarked Navy frigate. The scientific data, and the vessel itself, were placed under a security lockdown so intense that the researchers were barred from leaving their ship. The civilian discovery had become Operation Deepsight. The Pentagon's old files were dusted off. Analysts cross-referenced the unique acoustic signature and the estimated size of the wreck with every missing submarine in naval history. The size and configuration matched several Cold War-era vessels, but one name screamed out from the sealed pages of Project Sunken Echo, the Soviet K-315. The depth and location were radically wrong, but the dimensions were hauntingly perfect. Admiral O'Connell, the same officer from the 1968 investigation, now promoted, found himself staring at the same ghost file. The submarine that had vanished off Florida had apparently traveled south, sinking or resting in a deep-sea canyon near Puerto Rico. But how had it traveled over 1,000 miles while supposedly dead? And why had it left no trace of its long journey? The ultimate decision was swift and top secret. The wreck must be secured and recovered, not only to prevent the Russians from claiming it, but to determine what secrets, or what experimental weaponry, it held. A deep-sea salvage ship, the USNS Grissom, was covertly rerouted. Equipped with the most advanced deep-diving recovery systems, the Grissom embarked on a mission of profound historical significance, tasked with raising a phantom from the ocean floor. As the recovery team descended into the crushing darkness, they were prepared for a wreck. Twisted metal, imploded compartments, a scene of carnage. They were prepared for death. They were not prepared for the unbelievable sight that greeted their submersible cameras, a sight that would not only rewrite Cold War naval history, but also plunge the investigators into a new kind of terror. The K-315 was not a wreck. She was sitting upright, perfectly intact, like a car parked for the night. And she was waiting. Operation Ghost, raising the phantom. The discovery of the K-315 sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of the U.S. Navy. The vessel was located at an extreme depth, far beyond the capabilities of Russian recovery efforts, and the absolute integrity of its hull was perplexing. The official decision was not to notify Moscow, but to proceed with a clandestine recovery operation, codenamed Ghost. The USNS Grissom, disguised as a deep-sea drilling platform, spent weeks working in total secrecy. Using remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and specialized lift cables, the massive task of raising the K-315 from its improbable resting place began. Every action was monitored by U.S. satellites, ensuring that the former Soviet allies, now watchful but financially crippled, remained completely ignorant of the discovery. When the sub finally broke the surface, 25 years after its last chilling transmission, the sight was surreal. It was not the rusted hulk of a wreck. The K-315 looked, impossibly, almost new. The thick black rubber coating on the hull, designed to absorb sonar, was peeling only slightly. There were minor biological growths, but the metal beneath was unnervingly clean, lacking the massive corrosion expected from decades in saltwater. Admiral O'Connell, arriving via helicopter to oversee the transfer, felt a cold dread that transcended military strategy. This was not a mechanical failure. This was a paradox. The K-315 was immediately towed, under heavy naval escort, to a secure, restricted facility on the U.S. East Coast. The final phase of Operation Ghost began. A joint investigation by U.S. Naval Intelligence, CIA analysts, and a hand-picked team of naval engineers. Their primary objective was to find out how the sub survived and what it carried. The inspection team, led by Commander Eleanor Davis, prepared for the worst. Toxic gases, biological hazards, and the macabre scene of 82 preserved corpses. They entered the sub through a specially reinforced airlock. What they found inside was a scene of unimaginable order. The internal spaces were dry and perfectly preserved. The air, though stale and cool, was breathable. There was no smell of decay, no explosive residue, no water damage that suggested a hull breach. The control panels glowed with a faint, residual light, and the pressure gauges registered normal atmospheric levels. Commander Davis's initial report, sent on a single encrypted sheet to the Pentagon, summarized the discovery with a single, stunned sentence. Submarine K-315 is intact and operational. The entire crew is missing. The control systems were still powered. The navigation lights were still working. In the torpedo bay, the ordnance was locked down, untouched. In the engine room, the massive diesel engines looked ready to turn over. Every station was clean, neat, and prepared for the next shift. But the crew was gone. The investigators moved through the boat, compartment by compartment. The beds in the sailors' bunks were neatly made, or had personal effects. Books, letters, and framed pictures of wives and children, stacked neatly beside them. In the galley, dishes were stored in racks, and canned food lay unopened. In the captain's stateroom, Captain Vasilev's jacket was hanging meticulously on the back of his chair. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no scuff marks, no indication of a swift exit or a violent catastrophic event. It was as if the 82 men of the K-315 had simply finished their shift, tidied up, and walked off the boat in the middle of the deep Atlantic. A feat that was physically impossible. The discovery was not only a Cold War puzzle, but a terrifying existential anomaly. What kind of force could remove 82 men from a sealed metal tube at crushed depth, leaving no trace of their departure, their struggle, or their bodies? The team knew the answer to the mystery had to lie in the one place they hadn't fully accessed: the K-315's journal logs, secured within the thick steel walls of the control room. These logs would contain the final, terrifying moments of the crew. But what the investigators found there would not offer a conclusion. It would offer a timeline that defied physics, biology, and the linear reality of time itself. The control room. Paradox. The unsettling entries. The control room of the K-315, the nerve center of the submarine, was the investigators' final, desperate hope for answers. Commander Eleanor Davis and her team of intelligence analysts approached the room with forensic intensity. This was where the last moments of Captain Vasilev and his command staff had played out. The scene was eerily normal. The diving planes were set for a gradual ascent. The torpedo firing keys were locked. The large black communication panel lay silent, but intact. The main focus, however, was the captain's logbook, a thick, leather-bound volume secured in a stainless steel desk drawer. With trembling hands, Commander Davis opened the log. The entries for June and July 1968, detailing the Red Shadow mission, were written in the firm, clear hand of Captain Vasilev. The final entry, dated July 5, 1968, was the last thing Moscow had received. No 02-14. Acoustic pressure increasing. Contact at extreme range. Executing emergency descent to crush depth limit. Preparing for silent running. Last transmission sent. Observing. The page ended there, the ink smudged, reflecting the hurried silence that had defined the next 25 years. The following page was, logically, expected to be blank or to contain signs of a hull breach. But the next page was not blank. In a different, slightly less practiced handwriting, the signature was that of Lieutenant Boris Ivanov, the K-315's senior navigation officer. There was a new entry, dated not hours later, but 3 years later. 20 May 1971. Navov Ivanov. Silence is complete now. The external conditions are stable, unlike the interior. The captain maintains posture. We continue the mission, though the objective is evolving. No change in atmospheric pressure. Fuel reserves remain high. The weight is the hardest part. The others, they don't speak of it. They only watch. Davis's mind reeled. The date was impossible. The K-315 had been officially lost, resting inert at crush depth since 1968. How could an officer be writing in 1971? And what did he mean by, the captain maintains posture? The team quickly flipped through the rest of the journal, their shock dissolving into a mix of dread and disbelief. The entries continued, sporadic but definite, detailing a chilling chronological impossibility. An entry from almost a decade after the sub vanished. 11 November 1980. Navov Ivanov. The solstice cycle is affecting the magnetic fields. We are attempting to recalibrate the acoustic arrays. The sounds are always there now, but they are not sounds. The food supply is untouched. I keep the logs current, though for whom? It has been 12 years. 12 years of silence. We are still observing. And finally, an entry only months before the sub's rediscovery. 4 February 1992. Navov Ivanov. We detected the shift today. A sudden lurch, followed by the complete cessation of all external pressure. We are moving upward. The mission is terminating. I have activated the beacon. I am preparing the systems for handover. The beauty of the final observation is overwhelming. We are ready. It's beautiful. The date on the final entry was 1992, a full 24 years after the sub disappeared, and a year before the U.S. Navy detected the ascending signal. Lieutenant Ivanov had meticulously logged his survival, his thoughts, and his ongoing mission inside a tomb that physics dictated should have crushed him decades earlier. The paradox was staggering. The journal provided an internal timeline of events, proving at least one crewman survived for 24 years. Yet when the Americans found the boat, it was completely empty. The log entry spoke of observing, maintaining posture, and the others. They don't speak of it. What exactly did Ivanov and the others observe for 24 years? And where did the entire crew, including the journal-keeping officer, go in the year between the final log entry and the boat's discovery? The technical logs, which would reveal the movement, speed, and depth over those missing decades, were the only key left. The investigators knew their next step was to unlock the K-315's most closely guarded secret: the data from the experimental mission itself, Project Chronos, the one thing the KGB had ordered sealed forever. Project Chronos, the technological haunting. The discovery of the journal entries, spanning 24 years of impossible survival, transformed the investigation from a salvage mission into a forensic study of reality itself. Commander Davis's team immediately focused on the K-315's most heavily shielded area, a cramped, unauthorized auxiliary compartment near the main reactor, which was only accessible with specific codes. This was the legendary special assignment the KGB files had vaguely referenced. Accessing the compartment required Russian-made demolition charges, but once the reinforced door buckled inward, the mystery deepened. The space contained only one thing: a massive, obsolete-looking piece of equipment bolted directly into the substructural frame, connected to the communication and power systems. It was labeled in Cyrillic, Project Chronos, Low-Frequency Synchronization Unit. The unit was completely alien to any known Soviet submarine technology of the 1960s. It was a dense matrix of superconductors, resonant chambers, and a complex array of what appeared to be specialized acoustic emitters. Most incredibly, the unit was still radiating a faint, residual energy signature, a low-level field that pulsed with unnatural regularity. Naval engineers determined that the Project Chronos unit was a highly experimental device designed not for communication, but for acoustic masking and displacement. The theory, hypothesized only in the wildest intelligence reports, was that it used extremely low-frequency waves to manipulate surrounding water pressure, effectively creating a pocket of localized stability around the sub. If this was true, the K-315 had not sunk in 1968. It had become frozen in time and space within its own self-generated hydroacoustic bubble. This explained the lack of debris and the survival of the hull at crush depth. It had been operating in a state of suspended reality, completely cut off from the outside world. But this solved only half the paradox. The equipment was off. The field had collapsed, allowing the sub to ascend in 1992. The mystery of Lieutenant Ivanov's journal entries and the missing crew remained. The team next managed to bypass the encryption on the sub's automated deep dive data logger. The recovered digital files, the K-315's true, hidden timeline, confirmed the Chronos theory. The data showed July 5, 1968. Sub reaches absolute crush depth. Project Chronos is activated. External pressure readings drop instantly to zero. Velocity is zero. The K-315 effectively stopped moving and registering external time. 1968-1992. Internal systems, incredibly, remained stable. The data logs confirmed that power reserves and atmospheric quality were somehow maintained for 24 years. February 4, 1992. The Chronos unit suddenly begins a self-destruct sequence. The pressure field collapses, and the sub begins a rapid, uncontrolled ascent, matching the last log entry from Ivanov. We are moving upward. The engineers realized Ivanov was writing the truth. He and the crew were likely trapped inside a time displacement bubble for 24 years, their internal clocks running, while the outside world aged. But the final, terrible piece of the puzzle lay in the last 3 minutes of the data log, moments before the Chronos unit powered down for good. As the sub breached the surface, the internal pressure readings began to cycle wildly, followed by a sudden, massive spike in acoustic vibration from within the hull. It was the sound of a violent, systemic emptying. Not an explosion, but a rapid, almost instantaneous ejection of mass. The acoustic signature suggested 82 distinct impacts, as if the men were instantly and violently pulled from the submarine by an unseen force the moment the Chronos field collapsed. The last chilling data byte recorded was a single, repeating, low-frequency wave pattern emanating from the Chronos unit itself, before it finally died. An engineer, looking at the pattern, whispered a terrible observation. "It's not a malfunction, it's a signature." The K-315 hadn't just been a testbed for a time-stopping field. It had been a bait for something else. Something the crew, including Lieutenant Ivanov, were ordered to observe, and something that took them the moment their protective bubble dissolved. The final log entry now carried a terrifying double meaning. "We are ready. It's beautiful." What the investigators found on board shocked even the KGB, who, even years later, would be forced to acknowledge the boat's true, terrifying purpose. The final observation. An unearthly exchange. The evidence from Project Chronos, the 24 years of suspended time, followed by the sudden, systemic emptying of the vessel, forced the joint U.S. investigation team to confront a truth far beyond Cold War espionage. The K-315 wasn't a lost submarine. It was a sophisticated scientific instrument, and its crew were not submariners in the traditional sense, but unwitting observers in a terrifying experiment. Commander Davis brought in the leading U.S. expert on exotic physics and classified energy signatures, Dr. Alastair Finch. After analyzing the final 3 minutes of the K-315's data log, Finch offered a shocking new theory in a document stamped "Critical Paramount Secrecy." Finch argued that the Chronos unit was designed not just to stop time for the sub, but to open a temporary, highly localized window in the ocean, intended to observe phenomena that exist outside our linear perception of time and space. The sub, frozen in 1968, was an irresistible target for whatever entity or force resided in that outside. The key lay in Lieutenant Ivanov's last log entry. "We are ready. It's beautiful." Finch theorized that the crew, after decades of isolated observation, had either grown accustomed to, or become utterly submissive to, the force they were watching. When the Chronos field dissolved in 1992, the force was waiting. The final acoustic signature, the systemic emptying, was not the crew being killed, but being extracted. The sub's final resting place near the Puerto Rico Trench also suggested a clue. The trench is a zone of intense geomagnetic anomalies. Finch's team found that the Chronos unit's final low-frequency pulse matched the specific resonant frequency of the trench itself, a signature suggesting a transfer point or gateway. The K-315 had traveled 1,000 miles while displaced from time, only to reappear at the one location where the extraction could be successfully completed. The horrifying realization dawned on the investigators. The KGB and the Soviet scientists behind this mission had planned for the possibility of an exchange. They didn't plan for the crew's return. They planned for the crew to be taken in exchange for data, or, perhaps, something else. The ultimate proof lay in the captain's sealed safe. Inside, beneath several layers of navigational charts, the team found a secondary document, separate from the official mission logs. It was a single sheet of Cyrillic text, labeled Protocol Omega. It was signed by Captain Vasilev and 2 high-ranking officials from the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The protocol was a brief, brutal set of instructions detailing the procedure for terminating the Chronos field in the event of positive contact and systemic submission. It concluded with a handwritten note by Vasilev himself, dated just before the final log entry in 1968. If the observation is complete, and they offer the new understanding, the crew accepts the final duty. The secret is the transfer, not the recovery. The crew hadn't defected, nor had they been vaporized by a simple explosion. They had completed their mission of observation, and in the final moments of their liberation from the time bubble, they had been taken by the force they were observing, achieving the final duty. The KGB, in 1968, had not been looking for a lost submarine. They had been establishing plausible deniability for a scheduled, non-human encounter. The K-315 was a vessel that successfully bridged 2 realities, and its crew was the price of admission. The implications for the entire history of the Cold War, and indeed for human history, were staggering. This discovery completely rewrote Cold War naval history and raised new, unthinkable questions. The highest political authorities in the newly formed Russian Federation were discreetly notified of the discovery. Their response was immediate, terse, and chilling. Collaborate fully, but ensure the world never learns the truth. The secret, they made clear, must remain sealed. The ultimate sealing, the truth buried anew. The findings from the K-315 were deemed too volatile, too shattering to the global framework, to ever reach the public. The realization that the Soviet Union had executed a mission to facilitate an unearthly exchange was a secret that governments on both sides of the defunct Cold War agreed must be buried forever. The truth about Project Chronos and the fate of Captain Vasilev's crew had to be replaced with a final, unbreakable lie. High-level, secretive negotiations began between the Pentagon and the newly formed Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor to the KGB. Admiral O'Connell, representing the American side, met with General Igor Krylov of the FSB in a secure facility in Geneva. The atmosphere was one of strained, terrifying solidarity. They were not negotiating peace treaties. They were negotiating the stability of human sanity. General Krylov's opening statement was chillingly direct. The submarine is a technical failure, Commander. A Soviet tragedy caused by a battery explosion. That is the only acceptable history. The joint agreement, dubbed the Geneva Protocol of '93, was meticulous in its deception. First, the physical evidence. The K-315 itself was to be returned to Russia. However, before the transfer, the Chronos unit was systematically and irreversibly destroyed by U.S. Navy engineers. The control room and the captain's safe were incinerated. The goal was to eliminate all physical proof of the time distortion and the subsequent extraction. Second, the paper trail. Lieutenant Ivanov's terrifying journal, the Protocol Omega, and the acoustic data logs detailing the final moments were all seized by the U.S. and copied under critical security. The originals were handed to Krylov, who guaranteed their permanent burial in the deepest FSB archives. The official Russian file would be rewritten to state that the K-315 was sunk by an internal hydrogen explosion off the coast of Cuba, a location far enough from the U.S. to save American face and close enough to justify the original mission. Third, the witnesses. Every scientist, engineer, and officer involved in Operation Ghost was forced to sign non-disclosure agreements that included provisions for lifelong surveillance and severe penalties for any breach. Commander Davis, Dr. Finch, and Admiral O'Connell were all given promotions and quietly reassigned to remote, non-analytical posts. The question of why the entire recovery operation was kept secret until now was answered by the simple necessity of global control. The K-315 was eventually towed back across the Atlantic, reaching a guarded Russian naval base in the Arctic. It was quickly broken down in a dry dock heavily monitored by Russian and, covertly, American satellites. The vessel was never displayed, and the remains of the hull were melted down. The official statement issued years later by the Russian Admiralty was a single, curt sentence. Submarine K-315 was lost in 1968 due to a technical failure and was never recovered. The fate of the 82 men, who had dedicated 24 years to a silent, impossible mission of observation and ultimate sacrifice, was sealed beneath the official lie. The disappearance of the Soviet submarine had not been a sign of weakness, but a horrifying glimpse into a secret technological ambition that transcended the simple military conflict of the Cold War. It was the moment that Moscow discovered a door into something unexplainable, and the crew of the K-315 was the payment. The mystery was finally closed, locked away in the most secure vaults of both nations. But for the few who had read the final, desperate entries of Lieutenant Ivanov, the knowledge remains a chilling, hidden truth. The K-315 did not fail its mission. It completed it perfectly, and in doing so, offered the final, terrifying proof that humanity is not alone in its command of time and space, and that some secrets are far too great to ever be known. The ghost ship of the Atlantic had fulfilled its terrible destiny.